Victor stared at the mirror in the tiny bathroom, his pale face reflecting years of emotional strain. His eyes, once filled with dreams, now bore the weight of exhaustion and defeat. At just 21 years old, he felt like an old man, carrying the burden of a marriage that was slowly eating away at him. In the beginning, he and his wife had shared plans for the future. But over the years, what had once been love turned into an endless cycle of accusations, insults, and betrayals. The atmosphere at home was suffocating. With every argument, their shouting reverberated through the thin walls of the modest house. Broken objects and overturned furniture stood as silent witnesses to a relationship falling apart. His wife, once so caring, now hurled sharp words like daggers. "You're a failure, Victor," she screamed, echoing the fear he had already begun to believe. Victor started doubting himself, and the final blow came when his suspicions were confirmed. His wife was having an affair. He noticed the furtive smiles as she typed on her phone, the flimsy excuses for leaving the house late at night. It all came together like a cruel puzzle when he returned home early one day to find the living room empty, with the distinct scent of a man's cologne, one that wasn't his. Sitting at the kitchen table, Victor felt paralyzed. His mind swung between anger, sadness, and overwhelming despair. He looked at his daughters, Julia and Emma, 5-year-old twins, playing in the corner with their worn-out toys. They were his only source of joy, but even that seemed to be slipping away in the chaos surrounding him. He loved his daughters, but the storm raging inside him was pulling him further from them. In the days that followed, Victor barely functioned. He went to work like an automaton and returned home only to lock himself in his room. The girls, too young to understand, watched their father with confused and frightened eyes. Julia, more perceptive, held her sister's hand and whispered, "It'll be okay, Emma. Daddy's just sad." But even Julia felt the growing emotional distance as an expanding void. Victor knew he was failing his daughters. He wanted to be strong for them, but every attempt to connect was swallowed by the darkness consuming him. He was trapped in a web of pain and guilt, unable to see a way out. It was a cold, silent night. Victor sat on the couch, staring blankly out the window. The house was completely still, except for the soft breathing of Julia and Emma sleeping in the next room. He could hear his mind battling against the decision that already felt inevitable. His wife's last screams echoed in his head. "You were never good enough for us." He knew he couldn't continue like this. Each passing day left him feeling more useless, more incapable of being the father his girls needed. He looked around at the worn-out walls of the house, feeling trapped. That's when he made the decision that would change their lives forever. Rising from the couch, Victor grabbed a small suitcase and packed a few clothes. He walked to the girls' room. Julia and Emma were curled up together, their synchronized breathing a peaceful rhythm that contrasted with the storm inside him. Victor stood at the door for a long time, watching them. He wanted to step closer, kiss their foreheads, and apologize, but he knew he wouldn't have the strength to leave if he did. A solitary tear rolled down his cheek as he murmured, "I'm so sorry." Leaving the suitcase on the floor, he walked out of the house. As he closed the door, it felt like a piece of his soul was being torn away. When Julia woke up the next morning, she sensed something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet. She got up and went to Victor's room, only to find the bed empty. The suitcase that usually sat by the door was gone. "Daddy," she called, but there was no response. Emma woke up soon after, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong, Julia?" she asked sleepily. Julia held her sister's hand, trying to stay calm. "Daddy left. But don't worry, he'll be back soon," she lied, trying not to scare her. Deep down, Julia felt a growing fear. The days that followed were harsh. With little food and no adult around, Julia did her best to care for Emma. She reheated leftover soup and carefully rationed the last slices of bread. At night, when the cold in the old house became unbearable, Julia hugged Emma to keep her warm. Emma often cried, asking when their dad would come back. Each question was like a knife to Julia's heart, but she kept a brave face. "He's busy, but he'll be back," she repeated, though the words sounded less convincing each time. The weight of abandonment began to crush Julia, but she refused to give up. She knew she had to be strong for Emma, even as the world around her seemed to crumble. Morning arrived, bringing with it a damp chill that seeped through the cracks in the house. Julia woke first, pulling the thin blanket over Emma's shoulders as her sister slept. Both of their stomachs growled, a cruel reminder of their inadequate meals over the past few days. Julia sighed, rubbing her eyes, fighting back the growing despair. She was only a child, but now bore the responsibility of protecting her sister. In the kitchen cupboard, only a few stale crackers remained. Julia took them and shared them with Emma, who woke up rubbing her eyes and smiling timidly. "Is this all, Julia?" her younger sister asked softly. "Yes, but I'll get more food." "Don't worry, Emma," Julia replied, trying to sound confident. She knew she had to be strong. After helping Emma get dressed, she left her sister in the living room, promising to return soon. The icy air outside hit her as soon as she stepped through the door. The streets were empty, save for a few stray dogs searching for scraps. Julia eyed the trash cans on the sidewalk. It was humiliating, but their hunger was stronger than her pride. She searched through the garbage behind a local bakery and found a hard piece of bread and a half-eaten apple. This will have to do, she thought, ignoring her disgust. Back home, Emma ran to hug her. Julia smiled, showing off her small haul. They divided the food silently, chewing slowly to make it last. After eating, Emma picked up her tattered rag doll and played on the floor. But Julia couldn't escape her dark thoughts. The nights were the hardest. With the wind howling outside and the house eerily silent, Julia's thoughts became unbearable. She wondered where her father was, why he had left them. Even at 5, she knew something was very wrong. But she couldn't let Emma see her fear. When her sister cried from fear or cold, Julia would hold her close and whisper, "Everything will be okay. Promise." Days passed in this routine. Julia struggled to keep things normal, but the growing hunger and exhaustion made it harder. Yet, she pressed on, determined to protect Emma at all costs. One cold afternoon, as Julia tried to make a watery soup from the scraps she had found, there was a knock at the door. The sound echoed through the empty house, making Emma shrink into a corner, clutching her doll. Julia froze, her heart racing. Who could it be? She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Standing outside was Mr. Thompson, the neighbor who lived 2 houses down. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a perpetually concerned yet kind face. Julia had seen him a few times, but they had never exchanged more than a wave. "Julia," he called, his deep voice calm. "Is everything okay in there?" Julia hesitated, but Mr. Thompson's eyes seemed sincere. Finally, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "We're fine," she mumbled, though her tone betrayed the lie. Mr. Thompson frowned, noting the girl's thin frames and the state of the house. "I brought some food," he said, lifting a bag. "Can I come in for a moment?" Julia glanced at Emma, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes, and then nodded reluctantly. Mr. Thompson entered, placing the bag on the table. From it he pulled out fresh bread, milk, and a small tray of cookies. Julia and Emma couldn't take their eyes off the food. "No need to worry," he said, sitting carefully on one of the rickety chairs. "I just want to help." Julia remained cautious, but their need for food and safety outweighed her doubts. "Our dad will be back soon," she said, more to herself than to Mr. Thompson. He nodded, not pressing the issue. "In the meantime, why don't you stay at my house? I have an extra room. It'll be more comfortable." Julia looked at Emma, who seemed relieved but still clung tightly to her sister's hand. After a moment, Julia finally agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she said quietly. In the weeks that followed, the girls' lives changed drastically. At Mr. Thompson's house, there was always food on the table, a safe roof over their heads, and warm beds. He treated them kindly, as if they were his own children, helping them regain a sense of security. Julia, ever vigilant, slowly began to let her guard down, feeling safer each day. Mr. Thompson never asked intrusive questions about their father but always offered a listening ear. "You girls are very strong," he said one night while serving them soup. "And you don't have to face this alone." Julia and Emma gradually adjusted to their new routine. The fear and insecurity that had once gripped them began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of belonging. Mr. Thompson became more than a neighbor. He was the father figure they had never truly known. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the light curtains of the room, gently waking Julia. She still wasn't used to the comfort of Mr. Thompson's house, but she was grateful to finally have a warm and safe place to call home. Beside her, Emma slept soundly, a faint smile on her face as if, at last, she could dream without interruption. Julia carefully got out of bed to avoid waking her sister and made her way to the kitchen, where Mr. Thompson was already up. He was preparing breakfast, moving with the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Good morning, Julia," he greeted her warmly as he placed 2 plates on the table. "Good morning," she replied, a little shy but feeling increasingly comfortable in his presence. Mr. Thompson served eggs and toast, and with every bite, Julia felt the lingering hunger of the past days fade away. As they ate, he brought up school. "You'll start next week," he said encouragingly. "I know it might be scary, but I'm sure you'll make new friends quickly." Julia nodded, though a twinge of nervousness surfaced. She wasn't sure how it would feel to face kids her age after everything she had been through, but Mr. Thompson's confidence was reassuring. That afternoon, he took the girls shopping for school supplies. Julia was fascinated by the colorful notebooks and pencils of every shade, but made sure not to ask for anything beyond the basics. Mr. Thompson, however, insisted on getting them a few extras, including a new backpack for each. "You need this to start off right," he said with a smile. In the days leading up to their first day, Mr. Thompson helped the girls prepare for school. He read bedtime stories to Emma and taught Julia how to organize her schedule. Each small interaction reinforced the sense of safety he provided, something the girls hadn't felt in a long time. The first day of school arrived, and the sisters donned their clean uniforms. As they walked to the school, Julia held Emma's hand tightly. "Everything will be okay," she said, more to reassure herself than her sister. At school, they were greeted by a kind teacher who introduced them to the class. Although the other kids were curious and asked questions, Julia answered calmly, shielding Emma from the more invasive ones. As the day went on, they began to settle in, and Julia felt a small sense of relief. Perhaps they could have a fresh start here. As the months passed, Mr. Thompson's house became a real home for Julia and Emma. The routines they established, the family dinners, and the shared moments of laughter created a stability the girls had never known. Mr. Thompson, with his patience and kindness, became an indispensable father figure. Julia excelled at school, showing remarkable organizational skills and critical thinking for her age. She had a natural affinity for math, finding satisfaction in solving complex problems. "You have a brilliant mind, Julia," Mr. Thompson would say, always encouraging her talents. Emma, on the other hand, found her sanctuary in art. Her drawing classes became her favorite part of the day, where she could express her emotions through vibrant colors and detailed lines. Noticing her natural talent, Mr. Thompson set up a small art studio for her at home. "I want you to have your own space to create," he said, presenting her with a drawing table and a set of colored pencils. Emma was overjoyed. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with happiness. From then on, she spent hours in her improvised studio, creating pieces that impressed everyone. Weekends were reserved for family outings. Mr. Thompson took the girls to the park, where they could run and play freely, or to the library, where Julia lost herself in adventure books while Emma explored art volumes. These simple moments were precious, strengthening the bonds between them. Still, despite their new life, the scars of the past remained. At night, Julia sometimes woke with a start, haunted by memories of the old house and the cold nights spent caring for Emma. Sensing her unease, Mr. Thompson would often find her in the kitchen, sipping water to calm her nerves. He would sit beside her, quietly listening until she was ready to talk. "I just want to know why he left us," Julia confessed one night, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson sighed. Julia, sometimes people make choices we can't understand. But what matters is how we move forward. You and Emma are incredible, and that's because of you. These conversations helped Julia process her feelings. She began to realize that while Victor's abandonment still affected her, it didn't define who she was. With Mr. Thompson's support and Emma's love, she was building a future grounded in strength and resilience. Inspired by a school project, Julia proposed starting a small business at home, selling personalized cards and illustrations created by Emma. Mr. Thompson immediately supported the idea. "That's amazing. Let's make it happen," he said, helping them set up a workspace. The business quickly gained traction, with local customers praising Emma's artistic talent and Julia's impeccable organization. Mr. Thompson, watching the sisters work side by side, felt immense pride. "You're creating something special," he said, admiring their dedication. Though the journey had been tough, Julia and Emma were finally thriving. Mr. Thompson knew their emotional wounds were still there, but he also knew they had the strength to heal and move forward. Years passed, and Julia and Emma thrived under Mr. Thompson's care. Now 17, Julia was a determined young woman, while Emma, with her artistic talent, was beginning to gain recognition in the local community. Together, the sisters had transformed their small personalized card business into a prosperous venture, receiving orders from all over the city. Mr. Thompson was their greatest supporter, actively participating in every step of their journey. One day, as Julia organized the latest batch of orders, Mr. Thompson entered the room with a serious expression. "Girls, we need to talk," he said, his voice graver than usual. Julia and Emma exchanged worried glances. "What's wrong?" Julia asked. Mr. Thompson hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Victor is back in town." The news hit like a bombshell. The name they had avoided for years now hung heavy in the air. Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach, while Emma, visibly uncomfortable, began drawing furiously to manage her anxiety. "He came to see me," Mr. Thompson continued. "He said he wants to see you." Julia stood abruptly. "After everything? He thinks he can just show up and expect everything to go back to normal?" Her voice shook with anger. Mr. Thompson tried to calm her. "I know it's hard, Julia, but you have the right to decide if you want to talk to him. I just thought you should know." Emma, quieter, finally spoke in a low voice. "What did he say?" Mr. Thompson sighed. "He said he's sorry, that he wants a second chance." Julia's anger flared. "A second chance? He had a chance to stay, and he left us alone in that house." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I understand, Julia. No one can force you to forgive. But sometimes hearing someone out can bring closure." That night, the weight of the conversation lingered. Julia tossed and turned in bed as painful memories flooded her mind. Every cold night, every moment she had to be strong for Emma. Victor's return felt like an affront to the peace they had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Julia woke with puffy eyes from crying. Despite her turmoil, her resolve was clear. "I want to see him," she declared at breakfast. Mr. Thompson and Emma looked at her with surprise but didn't question her. Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Me too." Mr. Thompson arranged the meeting at his house, where the girls felt safe. When Victor arrived, the atmosphere grew tense. He looked different, thinner, with worry lines deeply etched into his face. His eyes reflected profound regret, but Julia wasn't easily swayed. "Julia, Emma," Victor began, his voice faltering. He looked down, struggling to find the right words. "I know there's no excuse for what I did. Leaving you was the worst decision of my life, and not a day goes by that I don't regret it." Julia crossed her arms, maintaining a hard expression. "Why now? After all these years?" Victor sighed heavily. "I was lost. I thought you'd be better off without me. But seeing what you've become, I realized how much I failed you. I want to try to make things right if you'll let me." Emma gripped her pencil tightly, her eyes focused on the paper in front of her. Julia couldn't hold back her anger any longer. "Make things right? You have no idea what we went through. You left us to fend for ourselves, and it was Mr. Thompson who saved us, not you." Victor nodded, visibly shaken. You're right. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know how deeply sorry I am. Mr. Thompson watched silently, allowing the girls to express their feelings. After a long pause, Emma finally spoke, tears streaming down her face. I wanted you to be there. But you weren't. Victor lowered his head, unable to respond. Julia, feeling the weight of her sister's words, decided to end the conversation. Maybe one day we'll be able to move past this, but not today. She stood and took Emma's hand. We're moving forward, Victor. You should do the same. The sisters left the room, and Mr. Thompson escorted Victor to the door. Thank you for giving them this opportunity, Victor said before leaving, his voice breaking. Mr. Thompson simply nodded, knowing the road to reconciliation would be long, if it was possible at all. The days following their meeting with Victor were tense. Julia felt emotionally drained, as if the anger and resentment she had carried for years had finally erupted. Emma, on the other hand, grew quieter than usual, seeking solace in her art studio, where she spent hours drawing non-stop. Mr. Thompson, ever observant, recognized that the girls needed space to process what had happened. He prepared meals in silence and avoided bringing up the topic, waiting for them to speak when they were ready. One overcast afternoon, Julia sat on a garden bench, watching the leaves slowly fall from the trees. The silence around her was almost oppressive, but she welcomed it as a necessary space to think. She knew that, as difficult as it was, she needed to find a way to let go of the past. Not for Victor, but for herself and Emma. Mr. Thompson appeared, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed one to Julia and sat beside her. I thought you might need this, he said, offering a comforting smile. Julia held the mug with both hands, savoring the warmth that spread through her fingers. Mr. Thompson, do you think it's possible to move on from something like this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her with calm understanding. To move on, yes. To forget, probably not. But peace comes when we choose not to let the past control our present. It's a process, Julia, and you've already taken the first step. His words lingered in Julia's mind for the rest of the day. That evening, she found Emma in the studio, gazing at one of her latest drawings. It was an abstract representation of an old house, with broken windows and locked doors, but above it, the sky was clear. Julia's heart ached as she realized how much Emma still carried the weight of their past. Emma, Julia said softly, sitting beside her sister. I think we need to talk. Emma looked at her, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and hope. About Dad? She asked hesitantly. Julia nodded. Yes, but also about us. About how we want to move forward. The sisters spent hours talking, sharing painful memories and moments of hope. Julia admitted that while she wasn't ready to fully forgive Victor, she wanted to find a way to release the burden he still held over their lives. Emma, in turn, opened up about her own feelings of confusion and sadness, but agreed that it was time to focus on the future. While the sisters worked toward finding their inner peace, Victor faced his own torment. He had returned to town hoping to rebuild a connection with his daughters, but their rejection was a painful, albeit expected, blow. Now, he wandered the city streets, revisiting places that reminded him of the past. Every corner seemed to whisper the mistakes he had made, and every familiar face avoided him, as if his shame were contagious. Victor had rented a small room in a modest boarding house. The thin walls amplified the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and on the loneliest nights, he wondered if he would ever be forgiven. He believed he deserved the pain he carried but couldn't help yearning for redemption. One rainy afternoon, he decided to write a letter to Julia and Emma. Sitting at the small desk in his room, he placed a sheet of paper before him and held a pen that trembled in his hand. The words came slowly, but eventually he poured his heart onto the page. The letter was a mix of regret and memories, a sincere apology with no expectations. Julia and Emma, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for everything I've done. I know I hurt you in ways that may never be repaired, but I hope you can find peace in your hearts, even if I couldn't give it to you. I don't expect forgiveness, But please know that wherever you are, I will always be wishing for your happiness. With love, Victor. He handed the letter to Mr. Thompson, asking him to deliver it when he felt the time was right. Mr. Thompson agreed but kept the letter tucked away, waiting for the appropriate moment. Meanwhile, Julia and Emma focused on their goals. Their personalized card business had expanded to include paintings by Emma, and orders continued to pour in. Their teamwork strengthened their bond, and each sale was a testament to the meaningful work they were creating together. One evening, after an especially busy day, Mr. Thompson handed Julia the letter. "I think you should read this," he said, placing the envelope in her hands. Julia hesitated but eventually opened it. As she read her father's words, a flood of emotions overcame her. Silent tears streamed down her face, and Emma, noticing, sat beside her and held her hand. After finishing the letter, Julia took a deep breath. "He really is sorry," she said, her voice trembling. Emma nodded, and the two embraced, realizing that while they couldn't forget the past, they could finally begin to release the pain it had caused. Months passed, and Julia and Emma continued to focus on their business, which had now become a true success. With Mr. Thompson's help, they rented a small space downtown to open their own store. The storefront was simple yet charming, with the business name elegantly painted across the top, Family Arts. The grand opening attracted a mix of curious onlookers and loyal customers eager to see Emma's unique illustrations and the personalized products meticulously curated by Julia. Mr. Thompson was there, as always, beaming with pride for the girls he considered his daughters. By the end of the first day, Julia and Emma locked up the store together, exhausted but elated. "We did it, Julia," Emma said, her face glowing with excitement. Julia nodded, a wave of pride and accomplishment washing over her. They had transformed the pain and struggles of their past into something beautiful and meaningful. That night, Mr. Thompson prepared a special dinner to celebrate the new chapter in their lives. Sitting around the table, sharing laughter and stories, the atmosphere was one of pure joy. For the first time in years, Julia and Emma felt they had found a true home and emotional stability. While they still carried some scars from the past, those marks had become symbols of their strength and resilience. They knew they were in control of their lives, despite everything. One day, as Julia was reviewing orders at the shop, Emma walked in with a mischievous smile. "We got a special request," she said, handing over a form. Julia examined it and immediately recognized the name. It was Victor. "What does he want?" Julia asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a swirl of emotions rose within her. "He's requesting a painting," Emma replied. "Something that symbolizes reconciliation." Julia considered this for a moment. "What do you think about it?" Emma shrugged. "I think we should do it. For ourselves, not for him." With that decision, the sisters began working on the order together. Emma created an illustration of an old tree, its branches scarred and broken, yet still blooming. Julia handled every detail to ensure the delivery was flawless. When the painting was finally complete, both sisters felt a sense of relief. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about proving they were stronger than their past wounds. Victor received the painting with a mix of surprise and emotion. He knew he hadn't earned his daughter's forgiveness, but the delivery of the painting symbolized a step toward the peace he so desperately sought. He hung the artwork in the center of his modest living room, where he could see it every day. To Victor, the painting served as a constant reminder of his failures, but also of the strength Julia and Emma had found to move forward. Meanwhile, the sisters' store flourished. They began employing other young people from the community, offering opportunities to those who had faced their own struggles. The store became more than just a business. It was a place of support and inspiration, where people found not only unique products but also stories of resilience and triumph. Mr. Thompson, proud of his daughters, continued to help whenever he could, managing orders and handling the accounting. He knew his journey with the girls was far from over, but he watched with satisfaction as they grew into strong, independent women. During a local interview, a reporter asked Julia and Emma about the origin of their store's name. Julia answered confidently, because everything we create here comes from our experience as a family. No matter where you come from or what you've been through, it's always possible to turn pain into art and hardships into strength. Julia's words resonated with the community. The store's impact spread, inspiring others to find their own paths to resilience and recovery. In quiet moments, Julia and Emma still remembered their past. But instead of allowing those memories to define them, they used them as a foundation for building a better future. They had learned that true strength lies in accepting what cannot be changed and using it to grow. The story of Julia, Emma, and Mr. Thompson became an example of how, even in the darkest times, there is always a chance for a new beginning. They found peace not because of Victor but despite him. And with that, they closed the final chapter of a journey that began in pain but ended in hope.